Yeah, perfect. So let's get going. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Defne Ayas, director here at MULTIDEPENDENT. And today is a beautiful day and a battle against Sinterklaas, but here we are. So I thank you all for being here and in the audience. Today's gathering takes its inspiration from the Dutch art historian, dealer, publisher, artist, furniture maker, obsessive indexer, and collector, Hans van Dyck, who is the subject of our exhibition upstairs, which we co-commissioned with Ullen Center, Asia Art Archive, with input from Vitamin Space and Bizart in China, who were basically the protégés of Hans van Dyck at the time. He passed away in 2002, died in Beijing, and he wasn't really known in this country at all, even though he was from here. So we've done a giant exhibition upstairs, and like with every exhibition that we do, we've decided also to take a prismatic lens upon his practice and focus today basically on artist and writer startups with focus on publishing, curatorial, artistic practice, as well as education. So welcome all. MULTIDEPENDENT is turning 25 in a month. It also allows us to think a little bit about the future vectors in global art production today. Today would not be possible without the content of Adam Kleinman, who's going to do all the introductions, without the organization of Natasha Hoare, input of Orit Gat, who's also on eFlux, leading the conversations now online. So if you want to join in, please do so. And our technical team, Lynn and Jonathan, and the Apple Galleries program, who will do the case studies. So thank you also for being here with us. Social media on, rings are off, eFlux is going if you guys want to contribute. So on that note, Adam, please introduce everyone and have a good session today. Bye.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'll be quick because we have a long day, but I did want to call your attention to two things. One is this little booklet that should be on your seat. If you didn't get one, get one. On top of also having the schedule, it has bios, abstracts, and things like that. So, you know, you can read those along while people are talking, and we'll save some time that way. But also, just so you know, I'm going to give you a little idea of how that schedule works. And basically what we're doing is something a little playful. We've divided everyone into two kind of different streams. One of which are various people working today, as Daphne had said, starting new institutions or questioning them, and so on and so forth. And they, if you look also categorically, they each, actually not categorically, anti-categorically, each of them fulfill a different sort of role. So we have discussions on publishing, institutions, artists' work, etc., and so forth. Then the second stream, and these will actually interweave, is meant to give some sort of, while everyone's working today and in working on sort of newer endeavors, to actually ground this in a little bit of history. So we'll have 3 talks that will look at older events from a sort of historical and retrospective lens to see what we can learn from that. To that end, since it is a long day, we're going to hold questions to the end. And what we'll do for that is we're going to have everyone back up and try to have a little discussion and see how it goes, because there's a lot of knowledges here that will be ensured, I think, be tapped upon besides the formal presentation format. And then please, hold your questions for that. Thanks. Let me kick it off with Mr. Toke.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me, Adam and MULTIDEPENDENT. And I'm going to talk about the post-commercial state of the art world today. And though I've been a writer most of my life, I was, until some years ago, very skeptical towards so-called inventors of words. And of course, you know, we invent words in daily life constantly. And new words enrich our vocabulary, but still, I was skeptical. I couldn't help thinking about philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said, and who famously pointed out that the meaning of a word is its use. So a word can mean many things, and one word can be used in endless ways. And then I was just thinking like, okay, good users of words, they don't need to invent words. However, something happened in 2009. That year I co-founded and started directing an art space in Copenhagen called IMO. And that's what you see on the image here, from the outside. And that is the inside. And IMO, it was a group of artists, and they hired me as their director, and they themselves functioned as a kind of board. So what we decided together was to turn IMO, the space, into a bastard. So it should be part commercial gallery, part art center, part cultural center. Unfortunately, our visitors, they were confused by IMO. They would go like, so are you commercial or not? So how can you sell if you're artist front? Why do you have such a big space? 450 square meters. We just struck a good deal, that's why actually. But so I felt sort of like annoyed by this thing. People, they were like trying to make their concepts and their use of concepts fit our space. And I started feeling ridiculous, saying, well, we're both commercial and non-commercial. It didn't really make sense. So I started wondering, like, why should an artist-run space be non-commercial? If you listen to the words, it doesn't make sense. So there are so many preconceptions tied up to the ideas of what is commercial that I just started saying, IMO is post-commercial. Way beyond that distinction, commercial, non-commercial. And then people pretty quickly got what IMO was about. So I'm going to tell you in a bit, in further depth, what the post-commercial is about. And the same goes for the words uni and multi-dependent that I've also coined. However, briefly returning to inventors of words. Well, since I've become one of these, I tend to be less skeptical towards them now. So Wittgenstein said, yes, the meaning is the use. So from that we might infer that we don't have to invent new words. We just gotta invent new uses. However, luckily, Wittgenstein also said, he said a lot of things, that sometimes some words are so abused, that the best would be to give them a break, to hang them outside to dry for a bit. So this goes, I would say, today for the words commercial, non-commercial, and independent. These words are in large part used in order to be abused, that is, instrumentalized. And since they have grown used to being abused, these words, they all too readily give themselves over to describing everything that constitutes the art world. Nevertheless, these adjectives concerning the commercial and the dependent and the independent, they represent a worldview that does not match the world, especially not the art world, though it guides it. So these words therefore occlude, I would say, the art world of today. Thus, the words, they easily come to manifest an unease within the art world, where the ideal and the real, they refuse to make one. So, therefore, it reminds me of this guy, Marshall McLuhan, and one of his many grandiose quotes. Our age of anxiety is, in great part, the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools, yesterday's concepts. And I agree, though I still, as a skeptic, want to avoid the opposite, namely doing yesterday's job with today's tools or concepts, such as, for instance, Nicolas Bourriaud did in the 90s and the noughties with his concept of relational aesthetics that I would say revived a Guy Debordyan attitude from the 60s and the 70s. So let's start out by looking at where we got this binary pair, commercial, non-commercial, from, and why this pair is yesterday's concept that obscures how art and the art world work. The divide between the commercial and the non-commercial, also known in more legal terms as not-for-profit, non-profit, or for-profit, goes back a long time. So money has in many periods been seen as a force that corrupts art, even though it's hard to find a period where money has not also shaped and nourished art. I'll just see. So this paradox, and I will call it paradox, I'll just see, yeah, is found at the very source of our contemporary conception of art. So let's go back to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance gave birth to the autonomous art object, when the market liberated from the ecclesiastic realm, the church. So as capitalism flourished, the new bourgeoisie, they pushed a demand for framed easel painting that could easily circulate the market. So you could say, stretching it a bit, capitalism set art free. And its newly won autonomy found a great articulation, of course, in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, especially with Immanuel Kant. And we know he defined the aesthetic experience as disinterested. And we are still pretty caught up in his idea of the autonomy of art. However, what is meant by disinterested has changed. So once the interest that Kant wanted to dispel from the realm of art was something like subjective desire or want within the observer of an artwork, and I'll get into this. In other words, if you're genuinely disinterested while looking at, for instance, a still life, you're not thinking about that you want a slice of that ham or you want to eat that cheese. No. You're supposed to transcend such needs. You're supposed to look at it at a distance and set your mind free. So desire to possess art or speculate in art was actually only one manifestation of an interest in art. However, today, commercial interest tends toward becoming the only interest art should avoid. Therefore, a disinterested artistic realm has simply become a non-artistic realm, non-commercial artistic realm. So one reason is that anything today can be art, and it goes along with ideas of the de-definition of art. So today, you actually have to eat the food that an artist like critic serves. And you shouldn't simply look at it, then you don't get it. So the conclusion is, today you can no longer say what art is or should be, but you can say what it is not and what it should not be like, and that is often non-commercial. Actually, this non-commercial is a great criterion, because the monster, the spirit of capitalism, is everywhere to be found. So there's always something to fight for and a way to make art count. Though we don't know, maybe still, what art is. But at least we have the scapegoat, capitalism, the market, commerce, etc. So, I would say this is, for instance, what happens every time you hear the documenter discourse. Every time there is a documenter, they have this discourse against the commercial. That's another photo from space. So I found this interview with the last documentary curator, Caroline Christophe Bakakiev. So the interviewer says, so is this a theme, this lack of connection? There is no real theme. The most important point today is for me to work without a clearly stated concept. You can work without a concept, and this has nothing to do with the way an art fair has no concept. It is a very different notion of non-concept, which has to do with resisting the commodification of ideas today. Pierre Week is on my advisory committee, and you know his earlier works were all about no-knowledge zones, and from a banal sociological point of view, you can say that we are at a time of cognitive capitalism, or knowledge capitalism, where the products of the 21st century are mainly products of the brain. And then the interviewer tries to get back to something. Moving away from the object into something more No, 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 no. I'm not talking about art yet. I'm not even talking about ideas. So that's what happens. So this is one articulation of the problem here. That because art has to be in opposition to capitalism, we talk so much about capitalism that we end up saying nothing about art. And art has nothing, and art has nothing, is even poor opposition, I would say. Yeah, I know, this is funny, but you know, this is from the press kit, the first press kit from Documenta, and there were like a few images of us and a lot of images of Caroline Christoph Bagagiev. And then there was this journalist and an artist who did something quite funny. They, of course, commercialized the press kit and made a limited edition of all these photos of Caroline Christoph Bagagiev. Yeah. And then, like, he's just starting out in the next documentary curator, but I also found this quote from Adam, and it reminded me of Caroline Christoph Bagagiev, and Caroline Christoph Bagagiev reminded me of Venice and so on. So, instead of writing a script for the exhibition, I propose to start by imagining a Documenta 14 that would take place in both Kassel and Athens. Greece is not an island. It relates to the global situation. Metonomically, I would like to understand Athens as a city embodying much of today's political, social and economic problems that extend beyond the proverbial notion of the Greek crisis. These problems, which are in fact as much European as global as they are Greek, remain unresolved, but at the same time create an opportunity to open up a space of imagination, thinking and action, instead of following the depressing neoliberal setup. Yeah, he could have said neoliberalist, but neoliberal setup that declares itself as the only way to go. Yeah. And it's not that I disagree, but just always this discourse. So, since disinterested has come to signify simply non-commercial, we've been led to think that art has, in a way, nothing to do with money, and that true art is made despite such means, despite money. Therefore, the aesthetic realm is no longer expected to transcend commerce. Art now has to oppose commerce. So, the non-commercial is, I would say, the last all-encompassing artistic criterion left, and therefore it ends up pervading everything, especially since anything, as we've seen, can be commercialized. So, luckily, this is not all my theory. So, I got a quote from Pierre Bourdieu. I'll just read it out loud. So he put it this way: the fields of production and distribution of cultural goods are all organized around the fundamental opposition between the commercial and the non-commercial. This structure, which is present in all artistic genres and has been for a long time, tends to function today as a mental structure, organizing the production and perception of products. The opposition between art and money, the commercial, is the generative principle of most of the judgments that claim to establish the frontier between what is art and what is not, between bourgeois art and intellectual art, between traditional art and avant-garde art. Yeah, that's from Les Règles de l'Art, the rules of art. So, I've written more about this in certain essays, so I cannot go into details about the post-commercial here. But I've made this scheme that quickly gives you an idea about what I'm talking about. So, of course, this scheme is simplistic. There is no temporal axis, no dynamics in this scheme, as there would be in a Pierre Bourdieu model. And it has to be said, so this divide you have here, between the commercial and the non-commercial, you also find the divide at both sides of the divide. So of course you can have more or less commercial paintings, and there are more or less commercial galleries, and there are also more or less non-commercial museums and so on. But so this is a mental structure. So we could try to test out if it works. So I could throw out some words that are not already in this scheme, and then I'm not going to try to place them. You can maybe place them yourselves. So if I say auction house, you know where to put it. And then also, yeah, assistant space, alternative space, performance art. Values like authentic is of course very non-commercial. Or you could even go for qualities like spectacular. So I would say this is not the way the art world works. So I would just like to mess up this scheme that I think is the mental structure. And I'm not going into details. I'll give you one example. For instance, like museums and galleries, they actually do a lot of the same jobs. They do a lot of research, they archive things, and of course they work tightly together. I could also give you another example which is a bit more tricky, but basically like affirmative critical. Like those who are critical might actually just be affirmative of the critical attitude, and those who are affirmative might simply be critical of the critical attitude. Like, you know, Andy Warhol, actually he wouldn't fit into this scheme. People would put him at the commercial pole, but he could also be critical, so you could, you know. So this mental structure is not a mirror image of the structure of the art world or art, because it actually shapes it. For instance, for a gallerist, it is more easy to sell an artwork in a museum or at a biennial, because these institutions are considered public, disinterested, independent, etc. So in short, they're considered non-commercial. And for the museum and the biennial, this is of course all good, because the gallerist will help finance production costs and so on, because the gallery is commercial. So these opposites I've sketched out, they do not mutually exclude each other. They rather like, they're instead of being opposites, they're rather differences that enrich each other. However, paradoxically, this divide is maintained in order to be trespassed. So, in this light, we might understand the rise of the only new agent in the art world for decades, the freelance curator. Though he or she might have this non-commercial aura, the freelance curator is actually potentially all over the place. So, you know, the freelance curator can work with museums, can function as a critic and work at biennials and work with galleries and private collectors and art fairs, yeah. I would say that this freelance curator is emblematic of the post-commercial condition. So he or she knows, he or she shows us how commercial and non-commercial activities are interlaced, and they do not exclude each other, but they rather feed on each other. And when I say show, I say it because I think the art world has long been post-commercial, maybe probably since this divide started to matter. So the freelance curator is just the first new agent in the art world that makes a difference without fitting into this mental structure. However, freelance is not the term that is normally used about this sort of curator. I guess it's because the first freelance curators, they actually, in the 90s, when they came to prominence in the 90s, they actually held positions in art institutions. So they weren't independent, so they were called independent curators. But it is also this term, independent, that prevents us from clearly seeing what this new agent shows us. So in cinema, for instance, where the term independent has been used for a longer time, it means non-commercial, as opposed to, for instance, Hollywood, that is commercial. So I would say there is no agent or institution in my scheme the curator might not work with or for. The curator, this independent curator, is rather dependent on multiple agents and institutions in the art world. The independent curator is rather multi-dependent, of course. At a certain point, at a certain level, the multi-dependent curator is like a door-to-door salesman who has a lot of small clients. And then at another level, this multi-dependent curator is in a strong position. It is not simply because it's a way of diversifying assets. It's also because there is a synergy in being multi-dependent. And actually, this is what IMO wanted to be, post-commercial and multi-dependent. and work to a certain extent. And I think the next talker will also speak a bit about this, or I think that'll be another example of how this might work. So the alternative to such multi-dependence would be a sort of one-resource economy, such as that of a curator who solely works in a museum, for instance. So such a curator is not beyond the distinction between dependent and independent. That curator would be, I would call it, unidependent. So basically, what I want to say is, there are only different ways of being dependent. And I'm not going to immediately create a hierarchy between these different dependencies, between multi-dependence and unidependence. However, what I do want to stress is, if you're an actor or agent in the art world, there is no such thing as independence. Instead of viewing independence as something you find at the commercial pole that we saw before, I would rather say it's something you find in the history of ideas. So, you find it in the writings of great philosophers of art and aesthetics like Kant and Hegel. You find their ideas about the artistic realm as free, whether it be the artist, the public, or maybe even the art object. So basically, it's fair to say, I would say, that the idea and ideal of independence is an update of old ideas and ideals of freedom that still determine our outlook on art. What's interesting, I would say, about our contemporary ideal of independence is that it is closer to a so-called negative concept of freedom than a positive one. So independence is about being free from, unlike a positive concept of being free to. So as such, the ideal of independence is perfectly tied up in the ideal of the non-commercial. So while Bourdieu, he presents the commercial, non-commercial opposition as fundamental to our conception of art, I guess it's also fair to say that this opposition rests on the idea and the ideal of freedom. And to fully live out this ideal in the post-commercial art world, where everything is mixed up, I think that would actually be a way of not making art and exiting the art world altogether. So the last thing I want to say is just like in the words of Schopenhauer, ultimate freedom is suicide. Yeah, that was all. Thank you.